And first one, we're going to start with regulatory development, cost and risk assessment. And moderator is Shelley Welton. She's the Deputy Director of the Columbia Law School Center for Climate Change Law. And she'll be leading 5 other panelists to discuss what are the main issues in policy side. Shelley?
Thanks very much, Alissa, and thanks everybody for coming. I think maybe we should get our panelists up here while I'm speaking, just in the interest of time. So you guys come on up. I'm really excited to be leading such a great group this morning, and I thought I would give a super quick introduction to the topic and then let them get to it. I too was planning on talking about the IPCC because I think it's on everyone's mind. And what I wanted to say about it is I think this conference and this panel are really timely given the renewed sense of urgency that I think the latest report has created. Combined with the fact that we're still realistically a fair bit off from widespread commercialization of CCUS. And I wanted to highlight a couple of remarks from the latest report that I thought, from the summary for policymakers, which is all us lawyers read, that I thought would really tee up our discussion nicely today. So the first is, so they're describing pathways to how we might achieve no more than a 2-degree rise, around 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent by 2100. And they said, many models could not achieve 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent by 2100 under limited availability of key technologies such as bioenergy, CCS, and their combination, BECCS, which to me basically just says it's likely that CCUS is going to play a key role in keeping us to the agreed levels of warming that the world is aiming for. Whether or not we're likely to hit them is something else we can talk about. And then the other thing they highlighted is the importance of well-defined regulations concerning short and long-term responsibilities for storage, as well as economic incentives for getting to a place of large-scale CCUS, which I think tees up perfectly the topic today that we're talking about, which is regulatory developments, costs, and risk assessment. Obviously, we've got the traditional long-term safety and storage concerns on the table. Under the current regulatory climate, cost is still a major, major concern. It just still doesn't seem viable. And then yesterday's air capture workshop was really fun for me in highlighting that we're moving to a lot of different methodologies and potential end products, which present opportunities and then they present all kinds of new risks and legal questions. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit too. So as I see it, today's panel basically implicates the key issues that'll take us from where we are, which is really exciting technological prospects and a renewed sense of urgency, to where we pretty clearly need to go, which is wide-scale commercialization of CCUS. So with that introduction, let me do very quick intros of our panelists. You have longer bios in your programs, and I'm not going to try and list all of their accomplishments. I'm just going to tell you quickly who they are. And I think I'm going to read them in the order that I think they're supposed to present. So that will give you guys a hint as to how you get up here. So Michael Gerrard is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School and the Director of the Center for Climate Change Law, and he pays my salary. And before that, he's been an environmental litigator for decades in New York before he joined Columbia in 2009. And then we have Scott Barrett, who's 2 down. He is the Lenfest Earth Institute Professor of Natural Resource Economics here at Columbia University, and a lot of his work focuses on institutions and international cooperation. We have John Gibbins joining us from the University of Edinburg down at the end. He is a professor of engineering and carbon capture and the director of the United Kingdom Carbon Capture and Storage Research Center. We have Raghubir Gupta joining us. He's the vice president of Energy Technology Division at RTI International, where he's played a key role in establishing their research program in clean energy. And then last but certainly not least, we have Klaus Lackner, who's the Ewing-Wurtzel Professor of Geophysics and the director of the Lenfest Center in Sustainable Energy here at the Earth Institute at Columbia. All right, so without further ado, Mike, I think you're up.
Thank you, Shelley. So I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues that arise. And it's really several different stages, each with its own legal structures: capture, transport, sequestration, and then post-closure liabilities. On the capture side, there are not currently any laws that require capture of carbon dioxide EPA is in the midst of a rancorous rulemaking process to come up with a set of regulations on new fossil fuel plants. EPA has issued a proposal for those regulations, which would, in essence, require CCUS, or at least CC, for any new coal-fired power plant. It is clear that that will be the subject of a whole host of litigation. There are already efforts in Congress to stop EPA, but it looks like EPA is going to go forward with those regulations that we know will have only limited practical effect in and of themselves, because very few people in the United States are building new coal-fired power plants anyway for other reasons, particularly the low price of natural gas and other environmental regulations. But these regulations are on the table. Next up will be proposed regulations from EPA on existing fossil fuel plants. Those are going to be much more significant because obviously there are many existing coal-fired power plants. President Obama has put EPA on a schedule to propose those regulations by this coming June, but full implementation of them would not be until 2016. We don't know exactly what they're going to look like, but the early soundings from EPA are that these regulations will not require retrofit of existing fossil fuel plants with carbon capture. Rather, they will give the plants a variety of ways to achieve reductions in their emissions through improvements in the efficiency of the operations and possibly paying for energy efficiency and other measures beyond the plant gate, but we don't know that for sure. The regulations on the new plants are a legal prerequisite to the regulations on the existing plants, so that's one of the reasons why we're going forward with that. Further down the road would be regulations that would require carbon capture at other sources of CO2, but that is probably several years away. The next step, of course, is the transport of the captured CO2 to wherever it's going to be utilized or stored. There are a number of existing legal regimes for pipelines that carry gas or fuels. As everyone here knows, there are already some CO2 pipelines, and they are regulated primarily by the states, except that the Surface Transportation Board, which is a federal body under the U.S. Department of Transportation, can review the rates if there are complaints. But there are other models for regulation, oil pipelines and natural gas pipelines. Various aspects are regulated at different levels of government, so ultimately a regime will have to be set up for determining how to govern the pipelines, and that will determine who sets the rates, who decides where they go, and whether there is eminent domain authority over property owners who are in the way, who don't want the pipelines going through them. When we get to the storage part, and here I'm going to be concentrating on sub-ground storage, either just for storage or for enhanced oil recovery, there are a number of interesting and still unresolved legal issues. First of all, there are several different things to regulate, things that may have different ownership. So it may be that one party owns the surface of the land where the injection site is located, and other parties may own the subsurface area, which of course could be much larger. Also a question about who owns the CO2 itself and who owns the groundwater that is passing through that area. It's relevant for several reasons. It's relevant, the ownership of these things is relevant in terms of whose permission is needed to engage in these operations. It's relevant to who is liable if something goes wrong, and it's relevant to who gets the benefit of carbon credits if those are afforded for this kind of operation. These property rights can have several different attributes. People can own the land or the gas or whatever it is own it outright, have title to it. They could lease it. They could have a license to it. There can be restrictions through easements or covenants or other mechanisms restricting future use of the land. There are questions about whether it is the land is whether these rights are transferable. So and a number of other issues. When we move to the issue of how do you regulate it, all those issues that I was just talking about are primarily a matter of state law. There are existing models for injection of CO2, as we all know, and storage of natural gas and acid gas, and all of those can help serve as models. But EPA does in fact now have in place a regulatory regime for the subsurface storage of CO2, and it's under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a federal statute designed primarily to protect groundwater drinking supplies. So after an extensive rulemaking process, EPA issued regulations in January of 2011. These rules have established that CO2 itself is not legally considered a hazardous substance unless it is contaminated. If the gas does become contaminated with other substances, then a whole additional set of legal issues can arise. The regulations set forth an elaborate process for geologically characterizing the site, for how the wells need to be built, for monitoring of the groundwater and the CO2, for permitting, and for monitoring and taking care of the site after the injection has taken place. There are a number of liability concerns that could arise in this process. The release of CO2 in large quantities that could cause health and safety problems, the dissolution of CO2 in the subsurface if it contaminates underground drinking water or hurts subsurface ecosystems or corrodes the well materials. Then there are the pressure-based kinds of issues that could arise, and all of these pose liability issues that have not yet been resolved. That may be in our future. And of course, if the CO2 is released into the atmosphere, not local effects, but seeing how that plays into the overall national and international regulatory scheme. So a lot of unresolved issues. How long would liability last? Is it cut off by statute of limitations? Is it cut off by bankruptcy? Can it be transferred? A whole lot of unclear issues. Will people be able to get insurance? Is there an ultimate backstop by the government? If so, is it the state government or the federal government in case whoever is liable isn't around to pay the bills whenever that happens? Final thing I would mention is that there is also a legal regime that has been established for the offshore subsurface storage of the CO2. The London Protocol to the Convention on Prevention of Marine Pollution is an international agreement to which the U.S. is not a party, but most other relevant countries are parties, and that group has put together a set of rules effective February of 2007 that do allow the sequestration of CO2 in subseabed geological formations. If the U.S. wanted to participate, it could voluntarily follow the rules of the London Protocol, which it does in a number of instances. And then finally, there are a few other legal issues that would need to be resolved. In the various greenhouse gas regulatory schemes, how would one account for the combustion of the oil or gas that is recovered as a result of enhanced oil recovery? Does that count against the carbon credits or whatever? Can regulated electric utilities recover the cost of all of this from their ratepayers in advance of there being a mandatory regulatory system? That issue has been a real impediment to some of the R&D in the area. What kind of carbon offset credits might be available? And finally, especially an issue that becomes relevant for cooperative efforts with other countries, what are the intellectual property rights? So there are many more questions than there are answers so far, but I don't think that any of the questions are insoluble. They're just tricky and will have to be dealt with at the appropriate time. Thank you.
I'm impressed. These engineers really know how to do things. Well, thank you very much. I wanted to follow on Alissa's introduction with carbon capture and storage, et cetera. We all know that we need to use it if we're to address climate change, but as she said, there has been relatively little effort gone into it. It's not as if the world is acting like we should be on what I would call a climate war footing. And there is this chicken and egg problem about will we act unless we have the technology? We won't have the technology unless we have the willingness to act. I think the entire problem really has to do with the willingness and has very little to do with the technology. The technology, of course, we need to work and be safe and not be very expensive, but the economics of this, as I'll explain, are relatively straightforward. The big problem is with our inability as people to get our acts together. Now, what I want to do is give you a feeling for this. So it's a little different from Mike's presentation, which was very structured because there is a law, but the negotiations are very fluid, and they've been going on for over 20 years. It's generally agreed now that they failed, and people are stumbling, fumbling, searching for a new kind of approach that's supposed to be ready for Paris 2015. We don't know what it will look like. It may not be any better than the previous ones. But let me just try to give you a sense for how to think about it. This latest IPCC report that Shelley mentioned says that it's kind of a funny report. It's actually focusing on what we should do as if there were no dispute about that. They say that if we wanted to keep temperature below 2 degrees C, which of course the parties to the Copenhagen Accord, et cetera, have all said we should do, that would require rapid improvements in energy efficiency, a tripling or nearly quadrupling in the share of zero and low carbon energy supply from renewables, nuclear energy, and fossil energy with carbon dioxide capture and storage, or bioenergy with CCS by 2050. Most scenarios that they were investigating involve overshooting. So basically what they're finding is it's pretty damn hard to prevent us from going over this so-called threshold for 2 degrees C, or they say 450 ppm CO2 equivalent. Addressing this, getting back on track as it were, requires widespread deployment of this bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and afforestation in the second. We have to start sucking CO2 out of the air. To stabilize concentrations, fossil fuel power generation without CCS must be phased out almost entirely by 2100. People who were here yesterday heard me say that they're arguing that for us to achieve these goals, we have to drop emissions to zero by 2100. There's not a lot to say about CCS in the negotiations in any kind of direct sense. The one issue that existed for some time was whether CCS would be covered by the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. But the Kyoto Protocol itself, its future is very unclear. There's a new version of it called the Doha Amendment that's going to run till 2020, but really it's just a placeholder. No one takes this part very seriously. The big focus really needs to be on what will happen in 2015. So the IPCC report is basically saying what we need to do to meet our stated goal. Where does CCS fit into this? Well, the main thing to know about CCS is that it's an add-on cost. Okay, maybe economic in certain small areas like enhanced oil recovery, but basically you're talking about something that's more expensive. So what's the cost? Well, I don't know. I found some numbers. I put them up here. There's a range, obviously. We don't know very much about the cost. We won't know until we get a lot more large projects up and running. The point I want to make, and this goes back again to what I was saying yesterday, is that we should use this technology if the social cost of carbon, which is a measure, again, of the value, what we care about, the value of avoiding a ton emission of CO2. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. But basically, if the social cost of carbon is bigger than the marginal cost of CCS, we should use it. Now, I showed you a bunch of numbers yesterday for people who were here, and some of these numbers are below marginal cost of CCS, and some are above. Over time, the social cost of carbon is going to be rising, so eventually we will want to use CCS if the world acts in unity. I don't know if you noticed, but we often don't act in unison. Here's another way to look at it. Let's take the number I had with the arrow here, the $12, and disaggregate it. That's for the whole world. But now disaggregate it and look at the social cost of carbon for individual countries. And you see, of course, they're all small because they have to add up to the total. And the incentive for individual countries to act is very small. And that's the essential problem. It's also why countries want to get together to negotiate an agreement, because they know they're all better off working together than going alone. But they also know that if everyone else is acting, they don't want to act. So they keep meeting and they keep failing. Now, the last page of the new report focuses on international cooperation. It's very interesting because it doesn't say much at all. It says almost nothing. It's pretty useless, I think. So let me just give you a little sense for how to think about this. So the IPCC basically is very top-down, this report, and what we should do. But there are really two problems. One is there's uncertainty about what will happen when we cross this 450 ppm. The uncertainty in the social cost of carbon should be interpreted really as uncertainty about what's going to happen when we move into this new kind of territory. There's also, however, uncertainty about where there may be a threshold. So the report has been written as if it's absolutely clear it's 2 degrees C, but my reading of the scientific literature does not say it's 2 degrees C. I'm not saying it's not 2, but it might be 1.9, it might be 2.1, or it might be quite different altogether. So the question I want to ask here is, what matters more, economics or geophysics? Now, I'm an economist, so what do you think I believe? Geophysics. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So these are the real negotiations, okay? So this is what we're interested in. This is what we're counting on. This is how I look at it, that these people are playing a game. So the question is, what can we expect them to do? Think of it that there's gradual climate change. So in other words, any reduction in emissions is always good. But on top of that, we're worried about things getting particularly nasty around something like 2 degrees C. So we'll call that abrupt and catastrophic. Now, you have a bunch of chips when you're playing this game. And you can put those chips into the table, and that will result in abatement, lowering carbon concentrations of greenhouse gases. And we're going to look at, this is an experiment I've done with a colleague, Astrid Dannenberg, from the Earth Institute. We'll look at 4 different treatments. These are experiments we did with people with real money, real people. One is you have certainty about everything in this game. Another is you have uncertainty about the impact. That's equivalent to having uncertainty about what the social cost of carbon is. But you have certainty about the threshold. The third treatment is you have certainty about the impact. You know the social cost of carbon, but you have uncertainty about where the threshold is. You don't know if it's 2 degrees. Or put it differently, with climate sensitivity, you don't know if it's 450 or another number. And then finally, we're looking at uncertainty about both the economics and the geophysics. These are the results. Now, the columns, there are 10 different groups playing each treatment. The first treatment there is certainty about both the impact and the threshold. The second one is uncertainty about the impact only. The third is uncertainty about the threshold only. And the fourth is uncertainty about the impact and the threshold. And what you see there is that the effect of impact uncertainty, which is uncertainty about the social cost of carbon, doesn't matter at all. You know that because the first 2 columns are blue and the second 2 are red. There's a little variation, but not an awful lot. The most striking result is that the first 2 columns are blue. By the way, blue means that you sail right past the threshold. That is, you guarantee there will be catastrophic climate change. We will go past 2 degrees C. The red, the blue says, sorry, I got it exactly wrong. The blue says we will avoid the threshold. We'll do the right thing. And the reason is we know where the threshold is. It is truly catastrophic. We want to avoid it. Now, I think if that were the problem we faced, the international system would work very effectively. The red is we sail past the threshold. And the reason is the threshold is uncertain. So if we go a little past beyond where we think we should be, instead of causing catastrophe, it only increases the chance of catastrophe just a little bit. So countries are willing to go past it. So what happens with uncertainty, which is intrinsic to inherent in this problem, in terms of the basic physics, my bell has sounded, is that we should expect countries to go past it. So the lessons, this is my last slide. Uncertainty about the social cost of carbon really doesn't matter that much. It's the expected value, what you expect to happen, that matters on the economic side. The uncertainty about the threshold, however, is truly crucial. In the experiment, it's best to avoid the threshold. So what the IPCC is arguing makes complete sense to me in some top-down kind of world. But the players in this game just can't help themselves from crossing it. So it's not enough that CCUS be economic. There also has to be incentive for countries to use it. So it can be true that this is a good technology and it would be wise for us to use, and yet we still don't use it. Now, a different way to think about this is if nature won't give us a threshold that's known with certainty, we should create one ourselves. So one idea is you're going to create a doomsday machine by wiring up all the nuclear weapons in the world to a computer, and once the parts per million CO2 goes to 450, measured in Mauna Loa, all the weapons go off. Now, if we did that, we would, I'm pretty confident, not 100%, but about 99%, that we would get our act together and we would avoid this threshold. But of course, we don't want to propose this. But what that suggests to us is that what we need is a strategy. And the one thing that the negotiations have missed up until now is a strategy. And I think that's the big challenge for Paris in 2015. And I think that's where the future of CCS ultimately is going to lie in the medium term. Thank you.
Okay, well, after that, I'm just going to, I'm a simple engineer. I do think engineering is important. But we're just trying to really, my sort of idea is essentially, let's get CCS and various other things available so it's no big drama. And then at least when people want to use them, they'll be ready to use them, and perhaps they'll just decide it's, well, we might as well do it because the cost is relatively low. And it's cool, and it's just like cleaning up other pollution. I think we have seen a lot of examples, mostly not with the same sort of extreme commons problems that you've got with global issues, but nonetheless where people have cleaned up just because it was no big deal and it turns out to be cheaper when they actually get around to it. So I'm just going to tell you a story about carbon capture and storage in the UK in a few different bits. I'm from the UK CCS Research Centre. We've been going in one form or another for about 10 years, and we basically pull together academic research in the UK and linking it with industry. And we do have meetings, quite interesting meetings, with everybody there from the CCS chain. And geologists, they're very fun people to drink with. And their lectures are very restful as well. If you're an engineer, you can catch up on a few late nights that way. Okay, so I think the UK really does, in quite large measure, follow some of this cumulative limit, and the objective is to get to the cumulative limit at a point where you've actually got the means to keep to it. So I think, and I think one of the arguments that some of the speakers were using incorrectly this morning is to say we'll do CCS when it fits the economic sort of criteria. And actually we ought to be doing CCS now just to develop the technology. There is the amount, the CO2 you save as of now is immaterial, but developing the technology, taking it down the learning curve is very important. And I think saying that we're only going to do it when the cost is below some barrier does get you into this catch-22 situation that you'll never get below the barrier because you won't do it. So really what you need to think about, and what we're showing here on the graph from Miles Allen, is that the objective is to increase the fraction of fossil CO2 taken out of the ground that you capture from 0, where we are now, up to 100%, in line with what we think are allowable emissions to the atmosphere. And if we're not on something like a linear track, then we're probably not going to make it. And if we are, then maybe we've got a reasonable chance. In this context, enhanced oil recovery, I really actually get very annoyed when people, for no reason that I can see, decide to look at CO2 emissions based on fossil fuel extraction rather than fossil fuel use. You could have either system. You could look at CO2 emissions based on the point, as we do, where you put it in the atmosphere, or you could look at it based on where you get it out the ground. But to talk about mixing them for enhanced oil recovery seems very sloppy thinking to me. Also, if you are actually trying to get down this trajectory, enhanced oil recovery, depending on what you're doing, is somewhere probably between 30% and 50% of the carbon coming out the ground that's captured. So you're well ahead of where we are now. So why you wouldn't do it, I really don't know. Okay, so where do we get where we are now in the UK? Well, 2005, the UK had the G8 chair and also the EU chair, and it did a climate initiative at Gleneagles. Interestingly, the climate communique was completely upstaged by bombs going off in the UK, in London, on the second day. But nonetheless, it put CCS on the map. And as part of that, BP offered to do a project at Peterhead, a natural gas-fired power plant fairly far north in Scotland. And it was called Decarbonised Fuel 1, DF1. This is the project. You can see the power plant on the right, oil storage tanks in the middle, and then a pretty large area of basically chemical plant. And BP, because they were risk averse, basically used large autothermal reformer technology they developed for gas to liquids in the Gulf. And they made something that would work, but it was a bit clunky. It was announced formally June 2005. It was cancelled mid-2007 because we'd started from going 2005, you couldn't imagine building a coal plant in the UK. 2007, we had about 10 gigawatts of new supercritical coal plant, very, very seriously planned. So we had a dash for coal at that point saying, oh, people are protesting. I'll show you some protesting in a minute about coal. The response is to do a pre-combustion project on natural gas. It's not a response. So we moved into looking at doing capture readiness for the coal plants and post-combustion capture. We ended up with 2 projects, power plants at Kings North in the south of England, Longgen in Scotland, and we had an Energy Act 2010 which came up with a CCS levy that was going to raise about £10 billion to pay for it. These are the protesters. There was regular camps outside power plants. There were protests in Westminster, very, very serious protests saying no new coal. And actually, we did sort of, after a lot of engagement with Greenpeace and had some very amusing conversations, we did get to the point really where actually no new coal without CCS was at least tacitly part of the agenda. And I think that was a big achievement. What then happened, though, is that the power plants themselves were shelved when we had the economic downturn. There was no capital available, demand had dropped. It was hailed as a success by the climate camp group, but clearly it was just down to the recession. So eventually there was a competition going on to develop the technology. E.ON withdrew from that. The Longgen project was also cancelled a bit later. It carried on for, I think it was actually deliberately kept alive while we came up with some responses. We had a bit of an investigation into why the government had spent £80 million on 2 FEED studies and got nothing for it, essentially, apart from some detailed reports, which anybody who's interested in can get a copy from me later. But then, very, very quickly, Department of Energy and Climate Change, and I will say some nice things about them later, started up a replacement commercialization program. They kept £1 billion in capital funding to do that. They shortlisted 4 projects thereafter. We've now got 2 preferred bidders. And we've also got an energy bill which gives a process called electricity market reform and feed-in tariffs with a contract for difference has gone to royal assent. So we actually can now fund CCS on the same basis as renewables and nuclear. This is one of the projects, Oxy Fuel plant built with essentially combustion engineering US technology by Alstom. This is planned to be built in Yorkshire with quite a long pipeline going through Yorkshire and then offshore to an aquifer storage. This is something I showed yesterday looking at the fuel. This will almost certainly incorporate quite a lot of biomass and probably will go CO2 negative. We're trying to work out how you pay for that. It doesn't actually figure in conventional electricity regulations because you can't do it for nuclear or renewables. But hey, no point in not rubbing that in. The other project is back at Peterhead, but now it's a post-combustion plant, which you'll barely see. This is showing the heat recovery steam generator. The capture unit, I'm told, will not be much larger than this. So it's a much cheaper project now. It uses an existing condensate field for storage, existing pipeline. This was actually the field that was planned for Longgen, so some of the money that we spent on that is not being wasted. This just shows how much of the plant is reused. So green is the existing equipment. Don't try and read the numbers, look at it on the slide afterwards. The new equipment is sort of amber, and change of use is yellow. So really quite a lot of reuse there, which helps to keep the cost down and also hopefully gets the build time accelerated. Decisions on these projects will be made in late 2015 probably. Now I'm just going to go through very, very quickly a presentation that really cheered me up, given by Matthew Bilson from our Office of Carbon Capture and Storage in DEC at the end of February. And this really is the most important slide. So now we're looking at 3 possible phases of CCS development in the UK. So the first phase is what I've just told you about. The second phase, as we'll see, with a bit less support, and then a third phase of actual deployment. We have a number, 13 gigawatts. Total generation capacity by then might be about 60 gigawatts, so that's a significant fraction of UK generation. And in terms of costs, there's a few studies done that show that if you don't have CCS available, then it could cost you about 1% of GDP to get the same reduction by other means. So phase one is the commercialization competition. This is people signing for the White Rose, people signing for Peterhead. Phase two is projects without capital funding. This is the £1 billion, but with support through the contract for difference mechanism. The government's formed a development forum to look at actual business case for these, working out how you would cope with the slightly different project financing requirements for CCS, learning from global projects where possible, looking at enhanced oil recovery offshore, and I noticed the diagram that Alissa showed didn't include enhanced oil recovery offshore, but we are thinking about it. We may not make as much money as onshore, but it's still worth doing. We're also looking at CCS from industry. We have quite a big industrial complex, big for us anyway, in the Tees Valley, which is about halfway between White Rose and Peterhead. That's looking at a study to capture CO2, also take about 1 million tonnes a year from an ammonia plant. And we're looking at sharing the infrastructure. So the pipeline to White Rose will be a 24-inch pipeline when they actually need, for the first phase, something like a 6-inch pipeline. So they're building for the future. Phase three is projects competing on cost. Again, probably under EMR. The picture there is actually part of the UK CCS Research Centre. It's a 1 tonne a day amine unit that we've got developing technologies, and we are looking at alternative capture solvents, control methods, really trying to bring the cost down, participating in development of technologies for the phase three. There's also a research and development program, 125 million over 5 years. The target is actually showing a number of projects. You can download this diagram from the DEC website, and also if you go on our website, there's a full listing of CCS projects, which actually add up to a bit more than 125 million. And then part of the big picture, the figure here, I think actually may originate with the Scottish CCS, is looking at using the North Sea and offshore storage as a facility for the whole of Europe. So this is really quite important. So that was where we are with DEC. So the key features, I think it's important with third time lucky. In other words, we've learnt from mistakes. We've had power plant CCS as mainstream policy for 8 years. Carbon capture and storage is the priority, not what fuel it goes on. So gas and biomass both very welcome. There's a support mechanism now in place on the same basis as renewables, and it's a complete waste of time, I should say, trying to rely on carbon price as implemented to fund CCS. It doesn't work because carbon prices start low and rise, and the cost of CCS starts high and falls. Plant level emission performance standard, we've got one. It's used as a backstop, not as the main driver. We're going for offshore storage, which isn't under anybody's house, so a very, very good start. Industry CCS is recognised, and as I should say, there's excellent academic support for UK CCS delivery, and we're very glad to see strong overseas links, North America and also China, key players. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. So what I thought I'll do is, I know Alissa asked me to talk about the cost and the regulatory issues. But what I thought I'll do is I'll give you a real example of one of the projects which we led on the CCS and what we learned and what the issues we had, so that I could share some of the experiences with you. So you've seen this slide, but a couple of points I want to make here in the CCUS is the industry believes the capture is reasonably well understood for both pre-combustion and post-combustion. It's expensive, specifically for post-combustion. Costs vary from doubling the electricity price to $100 a ton, whatever, depending on how you do it. And there's a significant amount of R&D investment from Department of Energy, Fossil Energy Group. They have spent billions of dollars in this R&D for the carbon capture. In this, so the capture piece industry thinks is a doable. Technologies exist, they may be expensive. The utilization piece is a new piece which started in 2010 when the storage became a little bit challenging, that how we want to do that. So in US, the primary focus on the utilization is the enhanced oil recovery, and I'll give you some specific examples of how people are looking at CO2 for the EOR. is definitely a viable option, depending you can get the CO2 to the right place. And the production of the fuels, maybe chemicals, could be a future option provided we have a cheap renewable power. If there is no cheap renewable power, there is no easy way for us to convert CO2 into useful product. If you're going to use more carbon, more energy which comes from carbon sources, it's not going to really help you. And the last piece is the storage. And I'll give you a specific example of one of the projects we ran. The geological storage provides ample capacity. All the studies which we have seen in US, there is tons and tons of capacity of storing it. The risk and the regulatory regime, as we heard from Professor Gerrard this morning, is the problem, and industry is not willing to take that risk, in that case. So this is the project we started in 2009. This is a working power plant at Tampa Electric in Florida, in the Polk County. So they had a IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle project, which was using pet coke and coal mixture to produce power. It's a 260 megawatt power plant. So with the funding from the Department of Energy, we basically said we were going to do a demonstration of a 50 megawatt scale. So we basically picking up roughly 20% of the flow rate of the syngas from here and going through the activated MDEA system, which basically removes the CO2. And CO2 is recovered, and the syngas is sent back to the gas turbine, which is essentially a hydrogen-rich syngas in this case. So the plan for this CO2 was, this will be roughly 300,000 tons of CO2 per year. And we basically going to inject this CO2 right on the site. So we spent quite a bit of time and effort in characterizing the geology, drilling a test well, get the core samples out, making sure all the permeability for the CO2 was acceptable. So we spent quite a bit of time on this particular case. So if you look at this picture, so we basically this is the sub picture of the site where we went through the drilling and got the core samples from various depths in this thing, and we basically determined that if we drilled 8,000 feet or so below, there was a pretty good cap rock where CO2 could be stored safely. And these studies were done at University of Southern Florida, Lawrence Livermore lab. And then in addition to that, we basically said, okay, if we can inject wastewater and CO2 together, what happens? And we found some really, really good synergies that with wastewater, you could have a very rapid mineralization of CO2. So we did a lot of tests in our lab. And essentially, based on these studies, EPA went ahead and granted us a Class 5 permit, which is under Safe Drinking Water Act. Class 5 permit was a extension of Class 2 water permit, wastewater injection permit. So we basically, with that assurance, we drilled the hole. It's 8,000 feet deep well, and well was ready. And then in January 2011, EPA basically says, no, it will require a Class 6 permit. So what does Class 6 permit mean? 50-year monitoring, verification, and an accounting requirement, and a $50 million bond for this thing in. And there is no way who could take that risk for 50 years monitoring, because monitoring is not cheap, and who will take the liability. So we try to look for an insurance carrier who could basically insure this risk. And everywhere we went, we could not basically so we got a capture unit built, we got a hole in the ground which was dug, and we can't inject CO2. So at that point, we could never reach to an agreement with the EPA to basically inject the CO2, and we de-scope the whole injection piece. So we are capturing CO2 or emitting it right now, but we can't really inject it. And mostly through the regulatory and risk perspective, So this is basically the real story of the carbon injection in the ground, So if CCS has to be a serious business, this issue has to be perfectly sorted out, and some clear guidance needs to be given that where people can really understand what the risk is, So this is one thing I wanted to share with you. This is a real case study. If you are interested, I'll be willing to talk to you and give you more insights in this, The second one, which is very prevalent, is in the US, is enhanced EOR is a CO2 injection source, where you can basically inject the CO2 and get the oil out in this, And typically, roughly quarter tons of CO2 will bring you 1 barrel of the oil out at the right places. I think this is a typical. And then again, some CO2 will come out with the oil, and how do you do the accounting for that CO2? That becomes another challenge here, So the one of the things with the oil recovery is the natural CO2 sources are not enough to get all the oil. And I think the CO2 which we pick up from power plant could be a very good resource for getting this extra out. And there's a huge studies done by the DOE where you could really look at the EOR potential. And at least it's a pretty significant, it's not an insignificant sink for the CO2 in this case, So again, I wanted to make this point is the EOR is only possible in stranded oil wells that have already completed traditional drilling. So it's basically a secondary and the tertiary recovery of the CO2 in these wells. So you can't really have every well inject CO2, But this is the chart, which is the most interesting chart. And if you look at, this is the plot of the West Texas Intermediate oil price. And it's the price of the CO2 which these oil services wells are paying, So if you look at this, it's about between $80 and $100. And the CO2 price is staying pretty constant, somewhere between around $40. So I don't know whether it's a coincidence or this is something, So the thing is, the oil industry is willing to pay this price to get the oil out from us, So $40 seems to be a number where they seem to be very comfortable with that, So this is a pretty interesting, I thought, was a chart here. So as we heard this morning, EPA's proposed rule of the 1,000 pounds CO2 per megawatt for all new plants, which are greater than 25 megawatt, will likely stop any new coal capacity because the cost of the CCS will be pretty significant in this case, So and as you all know, most of the coal plants in US are, at least 80% of them are over 50 years of age. And their thermal efficiency is in the range of 25 to 30%. And if they were to put CCS, they will basically take a huge haircut on that. So I don't think they will put CCS. In fact, putting a cost of a new NGCC plant is cheaper than putting CCS on the old plants. So it makes no sense for people to put anywhere the CCS on these plants. For the geological storage, the risk and the regulatory regime has to be clearly defined and streamlined, and industry clearly needs to understand what the risks and the liability issues are with storing the CO2 underground. Unless this issue is sorted out, I don't think you're going to see a lot of CCS in US, EOR is a niche application without extensive CO2 pipelines and matching sources and sinks for CO2. This is going to be a major challenge. It will remain a niche application because most of the EOR applications are in Texas and Louisiana, and the CO2 is in the Midwest, There really no good pipeline network, although they're developing it, and it might come in future, but I think this could be this definitely will be a niche application, not a widespread application. Okay, thank you.
So, good morning. When I started to think about what I'm going to say today, I sort of was worried I'm sort of the pessimist and downer in the group, but I think Scott took that place. Rather than talking about things I'm working on, I think I would like to use the opportunity here, because we are a network, to sort of think about things at a slightly higher level and try to figure out what this means also for engineering and designing. And I think one of the issues which is very clear, CCUS is ultimately for dealing with climate change. You can argue that we like, for sustainability, energy independence, and all of this, we might want to have these things. But the bottom line is we try to abandon fossil fuels ultimately because we see the problems and we need to figure out how to do that. And the U, which crept into that CCUS, is ultimately there to soften the blow. It's nice to have some benefits from doing all of this, which you actually get paid for. But the bottom line is you wouldn't have gotten through all this effort if you didn't have the problem with climate change. To put it very bluntly, if you want CO2 for EOR, probably the cheapest way to get it is bring a coal truck full of coal and burn it on the spot and pump it down there. Clearly not what is sustainable or justifiable, but it just makes it clear that we do CCUS because we want to deal with the climate problem in some form or another. So then the next question is it actually the solution to the problem? And I would argue, yes, it can help. It clearly is an important ingredient. We will need negative emissions, and we need to figure out how to get there. But I would also argue, if you listen to the discussion, certainly in the US, and I think Britain is a little bit of an exception because it's very enlightened about that this is about fossil carbon and not just about coal. In the US, the discussion is still entirely about coal. And if you read the IEA, it's still about stranded investments which need to be saved. And I would argue policymakers therefore think we do all of this because we have a large investment in an existing infrastructure and we have to rescue that infrastructure. And I would actually argue that's not likely to work. Certainly not for coal. And the argument I'll make is, you sort of heard an inkling of this from Raghubir a second ago, is the coal plants we have, by the way, here and just as well in China, were designed under the premise that the fuel is very cheap. And I think I can prove that by looking at the efficiency of coal plants in various countries. If you look to Australia, it's low. If you go to the US, it's a little higher. And if you go to Europe, it is even higher. And the reason is the coal prices have the same trend. So there's an economic optimization which was made, which says coal is cheap. It doesn't really pay to drive the efficiency up because the capital cost and all the other costs you incur in the process, we didn't make it worthwhile. So as a result, if you now come along and say, I'm going to capture the CO2 and get rid of it at the back end of the plant, you effectively raise the fuel price. Because because it's proportional to each other, I can simply roll that CO2 price back forward and figure for US coal, it's about $35 per ton of coal for every $10 per ton of CO2. So before you know it, you changed coal prices, which originally, when these plants were built, were $10, $20 a ton, up to $150. And then on top of it, you still have to buy the coal, and you buy roughly 20-30% more than you did before. So the effective coal price now looks like $200 a ton. If I were to tell you, forget about climate change, forget about all of these things, coal just jumped up to $200 a ton. We have actually, by observing what happened as natural gas prices came down, we know that the competition will jump into that and that these plants will phase out. I think the hard and long truth is we are not in the business of rescuing a stranded investment. We may open the door to having access to fossil carbon, but we are not opening the door to that old power plant which is sitting there. Now in the US this may not be all that bad because these power plants are old and are phasing out anyhow, but if you look at China, for example, they are being built at a rapid rate, and I think most of them are still in the same situation. That being carbon ready, carbon capture ready is not all that easy, and these coal plants are not all that efficient at all of this. So I think the focus we have on coal and retrofitting is wrong. And I think we have to get to the point where we say this is about the future. And it ultimately has to be about broad-based zero emissions. And if you listen to the IPCC, ultimately negative emissions. And I think for power plants and basically all big point sources, today's point sources, you have to figure out how to get them to zero emissions. This will be power plants, coal and gas. This will be steel plants, cement plants, refineries. All of these outfits which have have CO2 emissions have to figure out how to work them. By the way, I do want to stress what I said about coal plants air capture will not come to the rescue on that because it'll make it even more expensive. So this was not a pitch to say do air capture instead. I think you cannot solve this problem by having $30 a ton of CO2 tagged onto the back of the plant. So we will look at new power plants, at new infrastructure, which will have to be built, and I think we have to plan that way. And ultimately, we have to focus on natural gas as well. I think the emphasis on coal alone as solving the problem gives everybody a free pass. Now, some strategists may think that it's a divide and conquer strategy. You get rid of one after the other. But let's face it, in the meantime, everybody else gets a free ride because they are not asked to deal with the problem. So the transportation sector also has to get carbon neutral, and that's where I think negative emissions become critical. And ultimately, I think what you heard from the IPCC is we are too late. Whether their technical prescriptions are right or not, we will have phases of negative emissions in our future, and we don't really know how big they will be, but we have to figure this out. So I would argue we as a community have to figure out what is the right message to the policymakers and push that forward and manage to explain this is what we can do, this is what we cannot do. And I think we can move towards a zero emission future and possibly reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere to a level which is tolerable, but we have to position ourselves in that way and make it right. And I think I can close on this and give back the last 2 minutes.